Welcome back, grade 7 and 8. In this science fair video, we're going to take a look at some of the first two things for your project, and that is the question and the hypothesis. So when you're thinking about a science fair project, this can be the hardest thing to come up with. Once you come up with a good question or a good hypothesis, something that you're trying to solve, filling in everything else, doing your experiment, writing up your results, conclusion, everything else like that just flows from a good question and a hypothesis. So we need to start thinking about what really makes a good question, or what makes a good hypothesis, or how are those even connected to science and science fair projects? Well, a question really just comes out of wondering something about God's world and creation, trying to figure out or wondering how something works, or wondering what works best about something that's around you. And a question can come from anywhere. But I would recommend that when you're thinking about a good question to ask for science fair, that you should think about what you're interested in. If you're interested in sports, maybe there's a question about a particular sport that you've always had. If you're interested in cooking or baking, maybe there's a question about that. If you're interested in video games, maybe there's a question about that. If you're interested in reading, maybe there's a question, or drawing or writing, maybe there's a question about that can turn into an experiment. Once you have a question, so once you have you start off with a question. Once you have that question, you want to ask yourself, is your question something that can be easily answered through research? You know, if you just Googled it, could you find the answer? If that's the case, then you want to kind of tweak it a little bit. You need to ask a question that will better allow you to experiment, to be able to test something out, to be able to try to prove your particular question. The key is to find something that is manageable, a question that's manageable, and at the same time is just a little bit different from what other people are doing. You also want to try to be unique. For example, if there's a great deal of information on growing bean plants under different types of light, then you might ask whether different types of bean seeds will show the same growth pattern under different types of light. So take maybe what you were originally going to do and say, okay, well, this was already done, but maybe they didn't think about this. Or maybe they did a project like this, and I'm just going to slightly tweak it, and I'm going to look at these different items or factors instead. You want to think about with your question, is your question straightforward enough that I can design a project around it? You want to think, can I complete the project in the time I have? It would be fantastic, for example, to try to do a project where you're taking a look at the growth cycle of certain plants. Some plants, you might be able to do some work with that. However, we're already in January, and you have until March to complete this project. It's going to be really challenging for you to get that done on time, your experiments done on time, in the time limit that we have. It might be interesting, for example, to see a project on how the development of a baby changes over a span of 6 years. We don't have 6 years to do this project, unfortunately, though. Have I allowed enough time to get all the necessary stuff, approvals, forms, and still finish before it is due? And do you know people who can help you with that project? Right? Trying to figure out the timing of things can be tricky, and you might have a great idea for a project, but do you have the time to be able to do that? Can I complete the projects with the resources available to me? Right? Maybe you have access to certain things that someone else doesn't, but maybe you don't. One of the questions that I said, it would be fantastic to see, for example, which brand of tire works best on supercars. But unless you have access to a ton of different supercars and a ton of different brand of racing tires or supercar tires, which would get very, very, very expensive, that might not be something that you could test. Do I have, or can I afford the equipment and materials I will need? Or are you able to get them in time? And finally, where are you going to be able to do your project? So let's take a look at just a small basic question here that someone might have. Their question might be, what brand of flour makes the best cakes? Maybe that's a question that you have. It's an interesting kind of baking question. And you've always wondered, maybe as a family, you always use a certain brand of flour, but you've always wondered, is that really the best brand of flour, or could there be something different? Well, with this question as a starting point, I want to highlight a couple of key things here. One, we have this word brand. This word brand, what brand of flour, is telling me that, okay, if I'm going to do an experiment here, I need to get a couple of different brands that I'm going to test. Maybe I'm going to get 3 or 4 different brands of flour, and those are the ones that I'm going to use in order to do my experiment, in order to make these cakes and see which one's the best. The second thing that you need to think about is we have the word best here, is if I'm doing an experiment and I'm making, let's say, 4 different cakes with 4 different brands of flour, what does this word best mean? Does best mean best tasting, best looking, best holding together, best one that I can ice properly? What does the word best mean? So even when we have our question, it might need a little bit of tweaking, or at least some thinking behind it before we go to the next step. And believe it or not, the next step is not hypothesis. I know it says question and then hypothesis, but the next step is a big one: research. Before we can actually make an educated guess, which is what our hypothesis is, we're going to need to do some background research. So that research could include anything from, how do you make a cake? Because you're going to want to come up with some sort of recipe, and that's the recipe you're going to want to stick with. What brands of flours are you actually going to use, and what makes those brands of flour different? In other words, if I use brand A compared to brand B, what's the difference between brand A and brand B in terms of the different things that's in their flour? For example, is this one bleached? Is this one not bleached? Is this one enriched? Those sorts of questions are important questions for you to answer, and your research will help with that. And finally, then researching, then, okay, well, if these are the different brands of flour, and this is what is in the different brands of flour, what makes a cake, if you're going for the best tasting cake, what makes a cake taste best? And using that information through all of that research, then you're able to make an educated guess. And that research, by the way, is something that as you go along, make sure you're jotting down. Keep a summary of that. And that summary is going to go in your research journal, but later on, it's also going to go in your written report. You're going to have a summary of your research. And whenever you start summarizing and using a source as well, write down that source, because that's going to become a part of your works cited. So make sure you're keeping track of all of these things as you're going through the research process, which will then allow you to get to the next step, which is your hypothesis. So you have your question. Now we need to make our hypothesis. So based on our question, based on our research, what can we now say about this, this particular experiment? And usually when you're making a hypothesis, you can follow this general format. You're going to say if blank. So if I, if I am baking a cake and I use this brand of flour, then blank, because blank. So I know this looks a little bit confusing with all these blanks here, so let's put in some real world kind of words here based on the question that we had and some of the research to create a hypothesis for the cake that we're baking. So our hypothesis might look like this. If we bake a cake using, and here we kind of can state blank maybe we have 3 different types of flour, blank, blank, and blank flour. Bran flour. Now here's where we make our prediction. Blank, whichever one based on our research will taste the best. Notice I'm bringing up taste here. That's how I'm determining which one is the best. Because, and this is where I give my reasoning. Maybe it's because they use some added sugar within their flour, and so that added sugar will give the cake a bit more of a sweeter flavor, which I think will cause it to stand out, and people generally associate sweeter things with tasting better. Maybe that's what your research said as you went through, and so that would allow you to create a hypothesis. Okay. And your hypothesis is really something that you are creating based on your research, and your hypothesis helps you form the rest of your experiment. So now that I have this theory or this idea, I'm going to go through experiments actually to try to prove it wrong. I really in the back of my head, I'm hoping I'm right, because I'm hoping my research, I did enough research that I gave a very good educated guess. But I'm going to go through as many experiments as I can to test this and try all the different options or all the different stuff that I can do to see if this still holds up, to see if I can support my hypothesis or if I can find a way to disprove my hypothesis. So this is what you're doing in your particular project once you've created that. And so the purpose of the hypothesis is to clarify for yourself and for others what your experiment or study or innovation will prove or disprove, or rather will try to support or not support. It acts kind of as a signpost pointing to where you think your results are going to lead. Sometimes results are going to agree with your hypothesis, but some of the most interesting and even successful projects actually are those in which results don't agree with the hypothesis. If you go through your whole experiment and you say, oh shoot, my hypothesis is completely wrong. I did my experiment and based on my research, I thought this should be the brand of flour that would taste best, but I was completely wrong. It was this kind of flour. And sometimes those are the most interesting projects, because then you get to dig deeper into, well, why was that the case? Why was this brand of flour better than that brand when all of my research said it should have been this one? So now that you have your question and your hypothesis, now you're ready to start getting into thinking about the experiment. That's where we're going to leave this video off for now, though. Feel free to take a look at our next video as we dive into beginning our experiment with the materials list and with the procedure.